President of the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, good afternoon. This is quite a crowd. We must have a visitor. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. This is a great pleasure to host this event on work that Senator Cruz and I have been focused on for about 12 years, and so it's been a long journey. We're excited to be here today. After attending Princeton College and Harvard Law, because he couldn't get into a good school, Senator Cruz, I went to Penn. Senator Cruz clerked for Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist before going to serve in the George W. Bush administration. Then Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott appointed Senator Cruz Solicitor General of Texas in 2003, in which role he successfully argued landmark cases before the Supreme Court, notably District of Columbia v. Heller and Van Orden v. Perry. In 2012, Senator Cruz, who is of Cuban-Irish descent, became the first Hispanic American to represent Texas in the United States Senate. Now in his third term, Senator Cruz serves on the Judiciary and Foreign Relations Committee, as well as chairman of the Commerce Committee. He has used these positions to fight for the security and sovereignty of the American people, which brings us to our topic today, which is his new legislation, the Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act. And it should be noted that there are a few less members of the Muslim Brotherhood today than there were yesterday. And that's a good thing. When we started discussing the topic of the Brotherhood, who had been adopted as a sort of informal advisor by the Obama administration, they were not widely recognized as a national security threat to the United States. But Senator Cruz quickly grasped how the Brotherhood was exploiting the democratic process to promote political radical Islam, both overseas through proxies such as Hamas, as well as here at home through organizations such as the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR. More importantly, Senator Cruz is husband to the considerably more impressive Heidi Cruz and father to Caroline and Catherine Cruz. Please join me in welcoming Senator Cruz to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Victoria. It is great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for hosting this, and I want to thank my dear friend, Victoria Coates, for introducing me, for rightly pointing out that Harvard in particular has sadly lost its way, and for pointing to the indisputable truth that Heidi Cruz is spectacular in every regard. As many of you know, Victoria is a dear friend and has been a dear friend for more than a decade. When I was newly elected, she came briefly to assist me in becoming a senator, and she kind of never left. She thought it was a 2-week assignment and ended up spending the next 4 years working together as my senior national security advisor. She then became deputy national security advisor in the Trump White House, and today she's steering conservative national security here at Heritage. Not coincidentally, she and I had been working together on this topic for more than a decade. Not just the specific topic of designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, but across the board standing up to America's enemies and defeating them. Today I want to talk about more than just strictly the Brotherhood, or rather I want to talk about the role that this discussion, what we're doing here today, this afternoon in this room, the role it plays in 2025 Washington, D.C. In many ways, the debate that we are having is both a symptom and a microcosm of vast controversies, sensibilities, and advocacies that are convulsing the conservative movement right now. Politics in the United States, and not least of all, our national security discourse. I can think of no better venue to talk about these topics than here at Heritage, which for decades has been where these talks take place. Aristotle wrote that there are three and only three genres of speeches. There are forensic speeches, which face the past and are about proving things. These are the kind of speeches lawyers give in courtrooms. There are deliberative speeches, which face the future and are about what ought to be done. These are the kind of speeches that senators are supposed to give on the floor, although I'm sorry to say that is frequently not how it works in practice. And then there's the third genre described by Aristotle, which is epidictic speech. This is speech oriented towards the present and is about praise or blame. These are speeches about who we are, what we are, and why we are gathered. These are speeches you give at gatherings like birthdays or graduations, or don't read too much into this, at funerals. I will note, by the way, that Lindsey Graham did observe to me that the next time he visits the Middle East, he's going to make sure to sit next to somebody who is not on Israel's kill list, because it turns out it is very dangerous to sit next to terrorists in the Middle East. When I congratulated Prime Minister Netanyahu on the successes in taking out Hamas and Hezbollah, and in particular, the successes against Iran, as one after the other head of the IRGC kept getting appointed, and 24 hours later, there was a vacancy. I will say the Prime Minister quipped. He said, well, I just believe in facilitating forward advancement. But by the third or fourth fella, you kind of wondered, hey, you want to lead the IRGC? No, thank you. No, thank you. I think he'd do a much better job. I don't need to give this crowd a backward-looking lecture demonstrating that the Brotherhood and Brotherhood branches have engaged in activities, but that by any definition constitute terrorism. I don't need to prove that they have been a malign force for a century, causing geopolitical crises around the globe, fomenting terrorism and extremism, and undermining the national security of America and our allies. You all know this, and there's little reason to belabor the point. Tomorrow is September 11th. I have no doubt we'll get into these issues this afternoon, and as a litigator, I'm obviously committed to the idea that there's always value in laying out evidence and arguments for the record. But the people in this crowd certainly know many, if not all, of the details. I also don't need to give a speech in this room advocating that the Muslim Brotherhood and its branches should be designated as terrorist organizations because of that overwhelming and ongoing history of violence, extremism, and destabilization. That's a straightforward policy when one is faced with a terrorist organization, or at least it's the other solution to killing the terrorists, which is a damn fine policy as well. And again, we'll spend time this afternoon getting into the details and mechanics of designations, of what we should do, but those are legal and tactical considerations. Instead, I want to take some time this afternoon to talk about the broader debate around the Muslim Brotherhood. As I said at the top, it is both a symptom and a microcosm of very fundamental debates in our country and our movement that we're having right now. On the left, and unfortunately increasingly on the right, there are deep doubts about America's proper role in the world. Those doubts are sometimes described as isolationism and sometimes described as appeasement, but neither of those are exactly accurate, or at least they're not complete. Think back to the Obama years and the people who staffed the Obama administration. Think about their policies towards the Brotherhood. That wasn't isolationism, and it only looked like appeasement. Obama staffers, Biden staffers, and I'm sorry to say, too many people in our conservative movement, these were and are people who think America is fundamentally flawed, and that savages who seek our destruction have understandable and indeed justified grievances. When it comes to the Brotherhood, its branches such as those in Egypt and Gaza, and so much more, they're not isolationists. They're just on the other side. Of course, That position is completely unacceptable to the vast majority of Americans. It needs to be smuggled into our discourse. There are all sorts of ways it has been and continues to be smuggled. Some of those ways are dangerous and bigoted. Others are done through a kind of gritty resignation and defeatism. I want to, in particular, talk about two of those, which is how many people respond to what we're talking about today, designating the Muslim Brotherhood and its branches as terrorist organizations. Let's call these two arguments, we shouldn't and we can't. These two overlap, and you'll see people slipping between them, which I'll pause to add gives away the game, but they're worth addressing separately. Let's start with we shouldn't. This is the argument of Obama's Cairo speech. The Obama administration reportedly insisted that at least 10 members of the Brotherhood be in the audience for the speech. Incidentally, I've asked around and never gotten a good explanation for why it had to be at least 10, but maybe getting into double digits was important to them for some reason. But they insisted on having Brotherhood members in the audience, and they succeeded. We all know what the content of that speech was. Nearly exactly 10 years ago, December 2015, I was right here at Heritage, again, with Victoria, again, talking about this same topic. I compared the speech that Obama gave at Cairo University in 2009 with a speech that President al-Sisi gave that year in 2015. I contrasted Obama's world apology tour with al-Sisi's courageous speech. Al-Sisi called out the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. He called it out by name, and he called on his fellow Muslims to stand up against that evil. I talked about how Obama insisted that because Mohamed Morsi had been elected, Egyptians should have to suffer under his brutal rule, and that the United States should not pressure his regime even while he undermined American interests, destroyed the Egyptian economy, and allowed jihadists and weapons to flow from Libya in the Sinai. Obama officials openly embraced the idea that the Brotherhood was a legitimate political movement. They said that engaging them would bring moderation to that movement and stability to the region, and of course, they wouldn't even begin to consider a terrorist designation. Listen, towards the end of Morsi's catastrophic rule, one of the crises that gripped Egypt was a shortage of foreign exchange funds, which in turn led to a shortage of diesel fuel, which in turn hindered the ability of state-owned trucks to spray pesticide up and down the Sinai Peninsula. As a result, locusts overran the Sinai. Now, that made driving a nightmare. They flooded resorts. But I have to say, as a believing Christian who believes in the utter truth of the Bible, locust in the Sinai? You have to be pretty dense not to get the hint. But thankfully, as I said in 2015, maybe what happened in the summer of 2013 was not an ideal way to change a government, but we should shudder to think what would have happened in Egypt and beyond if the Muslim Brotherhood had continued ruling Egypt. Now, a decade later, we hear the same arguments about more crises, maybe even from more people. Radical socialists in the Democrat Party say what they've been saying for decades, that America is too fundamentally flawed by racism or colonialism or misogyny to be a force for good in the world. We should not pursue our national security interests. We should not counter terrorists like the Brotherhood because we're just as bad or worse. And dangerously, we're starting to hear the same discourse from parts of the conservative movement. They say America is too fundamentally flawed to pursue our interests, except instead of racism or colonialism or misogyny, they say it's because of wokeness or COVID lockdowns or past foreign policy mistakes. The justifications change, but the advocacy, the push for debilitating inaction, that always remains the same. And of course, again, they can't say most of that out loud. And when you tell them we are America, we are a force for good, we should act on the world stage, we should pursue unlimited energy and prosperity, we should unapologetically pursue our national security interest, well, when you say that, they slip out of we shouldn't and into we can't. They say we'll fail. Of course, that is also an old argument. Obama officials and others used it as an excuse for embracing the Brotherhood in Egypt. They said that the Brotherhood, and indeed that extremist Islam, they said that these were the future of the Middle East. They told our allies in the Gulf that they would have to simply accept perpetual instability, and perhaps much worse, because that was reality. They told our Israel allies to accept that Hamas, which calls itself the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, they told the Israelis that they would have to accept a Hamas terrorist entity on its borders forever because that was reality. We know they were wrong. Egypt and our Gulf allies have imposed sweeping moderation policies. Israel is in the process of utterly destroying Hamas. It should not be controversial to say that, of course. These acts are manifestly in America's national security interests. Every terrorist that Israel kills makes America safer. I will say, by the way, the Hezbollah pager operation remains one of the most extraordinary national security operations. It reads like a bad plot to a Jason Bourne movie, that if you wrote it would be rejected as being too implausible. But I will admit, after it happened, it's the first time in my life I've ever wanted to page a terrorist. We hear the same sort of we can't argument across contemporary national security debates. Let's take one recent example, the destruction of Iran's nuclear weapons program, which was begun by Israel as a part of their 12 days of attacks, and which was finished by the pilots of the United States Air Force at the order of President Trump. Few Americans would say that it is acceptable for the Ayatollah, who regularly leads chants of death to America and who means it, to have a nuclear arsenal. The number is not zero, but it's not a lot. So you didn't hear a lot of should not. Instead, the opponents of attacking Iran unleashed weeks and months of hysterical arguments that we couldn't do it, that an attack would lead to World War III, that it would lead to thousands of Americans being killed, that we would lose World War III, that Iran would defeat the United States. Absurdity after absurdity. Thankfully, President Trump ignored those voices. He ordered the Air Force to fly bombers shaped like Doritos from the American Midwest over Iran, at which point they dropped the equivalent of 1/3 of a nuclear weapon on the Iranian regime's nuclear installations. And that had exactly the effect that you would expect. It utterly devastated whatever remained of the Ayatollah's nuclear weapons program, because that's what happens when you drop really big bombs on things. There's a separate discussion to be had about the debate after the attacks, in which critics tried to downplay President Trump's success and to argue that no significant damage had been done. I joked a few seconds ago about what happens when you drop 1/3 of a nuclear bomb on centrifuges. But it turns out that some of the best and brightest of America's journalists and foreign policy experts actually are confused about that idea. But again, that's a separate discussion. I'm running out of time, and I want to preserve time for the conversation with Victoria and Q&A. So let me close with a very quick overview of how we intend to get the Muslim Brotherhood designated. I've said that we should and we can, so let me give you the how. The U.S. has developed 3 ways to designate an organization as a terrorist organization. Number 1, you can have Congress do it in writing. by writing the organization into the Anti-Terrorism Act of 1987. Number two, you could have the State Department do it by designating the organization as a foreign terrorist organization under the Immigration and Nationality Act. Or number three, you could have the Treasury Department do it by designating the organization as a specially designated global terrorist under Executive Order 13224. Each of these mechanisms does a different thing, though they obviously overlap. The congressional route is very heavy on visas and domestic transactions. The FTO and SDGT designations do different things when it comes to material support and so on. As everyone in this room knows, there are highly technical debates about which approach to use for which policy challenge. In July, I introduced my bill, the Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act of 2025. The way I dealt with that technical debate is I told my team to draft the bill so that it did all three. It's not the world's most innovative solution, but I'm also a huge believer that there is virtue in clarity and simplicity. The Brotherhood and its branches like Hamas are terrorists, and they should be sanctioned into utter oblivion. Before I wrap and turn things over to Victoria, I do want to discuss an additional and somewhat technical aspect of my bill, which I believe will be crucial to its success, and which is also part of the larger push to designate the Brotherhood in Congress, at the White House, and in the broader policy discussion. And that aspect is that we are taking a bottom-up approach to designating the Brotherhood in its entirety. What does that mean? In the past, in my previous bills attempting to designate the Brotherhood, as well as efforts of people I see in this room, we came close to success, but never quite there. And one of the reasons why I think we fell short is we took a top-down approach to listing what might be called the global Brotherhood. The idea was to designate the global organization and then all of its branches. Critics objected and successfully blocked that approach because they said that not all Brotherhood branches are currently violent. And so all of the branches do not currently, they argue, meet the criteria for designation. Okay, so we took a different approach. My bill now uses a bottoms-up approach. We start by identifying all the branches that the Muslim Brotherhood supports that are terrorist organizations right now and that commit terrorism right now. And then we designate the whole Brotherhood for supporting those indisputable terrorist organizations. There is no doubt that at least some Muslim Brotherhood branches are terrorist groups right now because they're already designated as terrorist groups. Hamas in Gaza, Liwa al-Thawra, and Hassim in Egypt, and so on. The reason I say that is that I expect in the next few minutes I'll get a question that goes something like this. You introduced this bill in the 114th Congress in 2015, in the 115th Congress in 2017, in the 116th Congress in 2020, and in the 117th Congress in 2021. What makes this time different? That's one half of the answer. The other half is that we have multiple routes to securing a designation, not least of which because we have a Republican Congress and a Republican president who is committed to countering the threat that Islamic terrorism poses to American national security. So we have both legislative and executive options. We can get into those technicalities now if you want, but let me close by thanking you again. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your clarity. Thank you for unambiguously supporting U.S. national security interests, which means being willing to stand up and defeat those enemies who would murder Americans. We have an obligation to keep our country safe. That is an obligation President Trump takes very, very seriously, and that is an obligation I take very, very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Well, you know I'm very critical.
I do indeed. You would write speeches for me on the Senate floor, and if I deviated a word, I'd get chewed out.
Well, what he would do is, you've seen this, he'll drop back from his text and start a little riff. And I would frequently build those into the text. But if he did it before he had gotten there, it was always amusing to watch and see his eyes go, like, I already said that. It was a game, like anything.
Well, I only have 4 jokes, so.
This is true. So this is playing off a little bit what you were just talking about, but I think we can expand on this because it's something we've worked on here at Heritage in terms of the challenge of defining the Muslim Brotherhood. If you could delve deeper into the legal challenges of crafting legislation designating the Muslim Brotherhood, because I believe the organization has set itself up deliberately to make this hard.
Look, I think that's right, but I also think the process of going bottoms up is an easier solution because the individual steps are clear and indisputable, and notably, this is the approach that the Trump administration followed in the first term to designating the IRGC, is that it designated initially the Quds forces, and because the IRGC supported them, designated the umbrella group, and that obviously you were intimately involved in the National Security Council.
And along those lines, I mean, what else do you think the administration is doing? It was interesting, I was on a radio show, Secretary Rubio was on after me,
Yep.
and he suggested that they were beginning the process of designating care. How would that work with this?
Look, I think it would be hand in hand, and any organization that is materially supporting terrorists should be designated. And I saw that same interview that Marco gave, and I was.
You didn't listen to mine?
I felt I knew what you were going to say, but I was very encouraged by what Secretary Rubio said. I think that I think we are on a path to getting this done.
Well, and I think that combination of executive and legislative writ large is what we should all be focused on next year to make sure all of the good work of the administration is not easily reversed.
Yes.
We also wanted to talk about the domestic threat here in the United States, because there is a temptation to think about the Muslim Brotherhood as something far distant from the United States. You think about Hamas, you're thinking about Gaza, in the Middle East, but specifically in Texas, are there threats from the Muslim Brotherhood that you and Governor Abbott are working on right now?
Yeah, look, there are serious challenges with jihadists and extremists in Texas. Texas is a big state. The Holy Land Foundation was incorporated in Texas. Now, they were successfully prosecuted and disbanded. But we're seeing in North Texas, we're seeing a development, the epic development, that is describing itself as a Muslim community enforcing Sharia law. I'm here to say Sharia law has no place in the great state of Texas. Thankfully, both the governor and state attorney general are standing up to it. Look, just last week, there was an imam in Houston who went into a convenience store, and there was a clerk behind the desk who was Muslim, and this imam threatened that Muslim. How dare you sell liquor, and how dare you sell pork, and we're going to come after you. And you know what? Look, I've called on the Department of Justice and the Texas AG to go after that imam for trying to persecute. I mean, this poor clerk was a fellow sitting behind the desk of a 7-Eleven or whatever the store was. But that kind of religious threats is contrary to law, and law enforcement has an obligation to stand up and stop it.
Can you take us back a little bit to the origins of your interest in this issue? You alluded to the fact that I was supposed to come down for 2 weeks to the Senate to handle the Hagel and Kerry nominations. Those were good times. But because you were not expecting to do a great deal in the national, sort of international affairs realm. So when did that obviously changed, and when did the Muslim Brotherhood kind of seize your attention, and when did you come to the conclusion that it was in fact a terrorist organization?
Well, when I was first elected to the Senate in 2012, I came up here, and Victoria was in those opening days came to just help us stand up our national security team in the opening weeks. And the plan was initially you were going to stay for a couple of weeks. And my background, I've cared about foreign policy and national security for a long time, but prior to the Senate, I had no professional experience in those areas. My background had been as a constitutional litigator. I'd worked on domestic policy on a host of issues, but I had not worked in a foreign policy or national security capacity. And so initially when I came in, one of the very first fights we had was Chuck Hagel. This is the beginning of Obama's second term, and Obama nominated Chuck Hagel to be defense secretary. Now, I didn't know Hagel. He'd been a former Republican senator, but I looked at his record, and his record was abominable. He had voted repeatedly against Iran sanctions, and I thought his record was a disaster from foreign policy perspective. And so as a brand new baby senator, and still in like the basement office that we stick new senators in for about 6 months, and it's purely hazing because there are 100 senators, 100 Senate offices, and for 6 months you don't get your Senate office, you sit in a little hole in the basement. I actually think we should extend it to about 2 years. But perspectives change.
Now you're out of it.
But we're down in the basement office, and we ended up leading what became the first and only successful filibuster of a defense secretary nominee. And that was before Harry Reid exercised the nuclear option, back when you could filibuster cabinet nominees. And we ended up holding at least 41 Republicans to oppose and to filibuster Hagel's nomination. And I will say, I think that fight may have been what persuaded you to stay, because you realized, okay, we're going to be mixing it up, and we're going to be fighting, and we're going to be leading. I will say, as a follow-up to that, sadly, Republicans did something that we have often been very good at, which is right after winning, we decided to surrender and give away the win, which I found myself completely confused. Like, wait, we won, but no. I was told by my more senior colleagues that now that we've won, we must confirm Hagel. And I will say, so every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, all the Republican senators have lunch together. And we were having lunch in the LBJ room. And John McCain was one of the people who had been with me initially opposing Hagel, and then rather vocally flipped, said, now we should confirm Hagel. And we're in the lunchroom, and John McCain stood up, and through gritted teeth, he began yelling at me. And he said, Ted, I was fighting Iran in 1984. Where the F were you in 84? And he didn't abbreviate F. It took every ounce of restraint in my body not to reply, in junior high? Because I was, in fact, in 8th grade in 1984. I did not respond with that. I just sat down. I took my beating. And as I walked out of the lunchroom, Pat Roberts, senator from Kansas, big old lanky Marine, he draped his arm around my shoulder. He said, Ted, you're not a real senator till you've been cursed out by John McCain.
Well, and I would just add, it actually wasn't the Hagel nomination, it was the Kerry nomination that persuaded me to stay, because Senator Kerry came to see us and extolled the glories of the Law of the Sea Treaty, which I've been a deeply committed opponent to for many years. And same Senator McCain was chewing on Senator Cruz, Senator Lee, all of the young folks who had come in to make this a 99-0 vote. It was to be a coronation of John Kerry as Secretary of State. And there's two versions of this story. Ted's version is that he knew how he was going to vote when he left. My version is he did not know how he was going to vote when he left. And so we had Chip, and I had Chip Roy, and I had to ask you when you came back, how did you vote? And I said, what was the vote? And he said, it was 94-3. And I said, you made friends.
We were part of the mighty gang of three.
The mighty gang of three. But it was clear that he was not going to be intimidated by these forces of the establishment, be they on the left or the right. And I think that is very much what this legislation.
Well, and you asked about the origins of this fight. If you look at what was happening in Egypt, if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi, it was horrific. And you end up having protests in the streets of Cairo. 1 million people standing up, and they were holding signs, and among other signs they were holding were America supports the Muslim Brotherhood, and America supports Morsi. And I will note at the time, the U.S. ambassador to Egypt, Ann Patterson, was there, and they were holding up signs with pictures of her because she was vocally supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. I will also note, fast forward to the beginning of the first Trump term, that she was nominated to be the Undersecretary of Defense by President Trump. He had received, I think, some very bad advice. It was Jim Mattis who was pushing it, who was the Defense Secretary. And as you'll recall well, I said, hell no, 9 ways to Sunday, that this will not happen. And I went to the Oval and convinced the president to withdraw the nomination, that it was a disastrous nomination. I'll tell you, Mattis came to my office, very dismayed. And he said, do you know her? I said, no, I don't know her. What do I need to know her for? I know her record. Her record is a disaster. He said, well, I know her. I trust her. I said, great. You know what, Ms. Secretary? Hire her to serve in your office as a counselor. You can do that. That doesn't require Senate confirmation. But this woman was the point person of the Obama administration's policy of appeasement on the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'll be damned if she gets named to the number 3 position at DOD, and the message it sends to everyone at the Pentagon and everyone at State that you can embrace and support America's enemies and get promoted as a consequence. And so the president withdrew the nomination.
And last question for me before we get to audience questions. So I know we have some of our brand new class of interns ready with microphones. So if you want to start thinking up very difficult questions for Senator Cruz, you can do that. But what will be the
I was told there'd be no math.
Oh, there's math. We're hoping that y'all turn your attention pretty with a laser focus on nominations. But what are the next steps forward for this legislation?
Look, Democrats need to decide where they are. In the House, Diaz-Balart is carrying it in the House. You've got 4 Democrats supporting it in the House. So it is bipartisan in the House. That's good. In the Senate right now, we don't have any Democrats supporting it. That is unfortunate. I am trying with my colleagues. One of my colleagues, I tried to get support, and the response I was given, Democrat colleague, was, well, no, this would upset all the Arab countries. And I'm like, what are you talking about? They've already designated the Brotherhood. They know exactly who they're dealing with. But right now we have no Democrats in the Senate. So if it's going to pass, Democrats have to decide they're going to support it because it'll take 60 votes. I am going to look for avenues to force a vote and put them on record. Because even though there are no Democrats co-sponsoring it right now in the Senate, it's a different thing to vote against it. And on the IRGC, I forced votes on the floor in both Senate Foreign Relations and on the floor, and quite a few Democrats ended up voting with us because that's a very hard vote to cast. So I am going to pursue multiple avenues to put our colleagues on record. And I think that will be in concert with the administration. We tried in the first Trump term to get the president to do so. I think we got close, but it ultimately did not get accomplished. And the main substantive argument was the argument I talked about before, that there's some branches that are not demonstrably violent. It's why taking the bottoms-up approach, I think, may prove more successful, but we are going to be actively making the case to the administration simultaneously that we'll be moving it in the Senate.
Sounds good. Let's start with Mr. Gaffney in the front.
Senator,
You're about to get a microphone.
Senator, thank you very much, not just for being here and explaining what your motivations are, but also for taking this on consistently. You are, among other things, an expert on the Constitution of the United States. You've just said that there's no place in Texas for Sharia, with which I firmly agree, as you know. Would you address the proposition that we will be hearing inevitably in the course of the debate on this, among other things, that, oh, no, that is a constitutionally protected right of religious freedom, as opposed to a toxic ideological agenda for taking down our country.
Yeah, look, I think the argument that Sharia law is somehow protected by our Constitution is nonsensical. The First Amendment to the Constitution, the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, the very first liberty of the 5 that are enumerated that is protected is religious liberty. And so religious liberty is literally the first liberty protected in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. There are 2 aspects of religious liberty that are reflected in the First Amendment. One is the Free Exercise Clause, the other is the Establishment Clause. Both serve to protect religious liberty. Look, every one of us has a right to believe whatever faith we choose and to live out your faith, whether you're a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, an atheist. Whatever you believe, you have a right to your religious faith. And by the way, if someone chooses to voluntarily live according to dictates, whatever the dictates are, that's a choice you have. But when it comes to Sharia law is all about binding people who don't share that belief. It is about controlling others. You can choose not to eat pork. As a Texan, I think that's a horrible choice, but you can choose that. By the way, Frank, I'm obligated to tell, actually, a story I told in the Senate lunchroom about a priest and a rabbi who were flying on a plane together. And they're flying on the plane, and the priest turns to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I need to ask you, have you ever tried bacon?" And the rabbi is crestfallen. He looks down, he's embarrassed, and sheepishly he admits, yes, I have tried bacon. They fly for some time more. And the rabbi turns to the priest and says, "Father, I need to ask you, have you ever had sex?" And now it's the priest's turn to be ashen. He looks down, he's embarrassed, and reluctantly, sheepishly, he admits, yes, I have had sex. The rabbi says, "It's better than bacon."
On that note, next question. And if you could just state your name.
My name's Cassandra Watkins, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for being a supporter of Israel. As a Christian, it's important to me too. And I wanted to ask your opinion on, we have got people on our side, supposedly, Tucker and Candace and all of these people who are going so far as being sympathizers of Hamas and Hezbollah. And this is a dangerous tone. And I want to know, what do you think we can do? What is your solution on shifting the narrative? Because I personally believe we are blessed as a nation in being a friend to Israel. It's important.
Amen. I emphatically agree. Some of that I referenced in my remarks here. I will say I am concerned about rising anti-Semitism on the right. We've seen it on the left. The Democrat Party has been a train wreck for a decade on this. But in the last 6 months, what we've seen on the right has been deeply disturbing. People who were prominent, Tucker Carlson has had 2 different professors on his show who sat and said, Hitler wasn't such a bad guy. No, Hitler was unambiguously evil. And by the way, I've said there are very few ironclad rules of politics, but here's one. Hitler, always bad. Just you're safe on that. He didn't make the trains run on time. He didn't have a small mustache. Hitler, bad. That is truth. By the way, one of these clowns also said there's a good argument that Churchill was the villain of World War II. Another professor said there's a good argument we should have supported the Nazis in World War II. Who the hell are these idiots? But we need to speak out and oppose it because, listen, at the end of the day, the folks who are saying this are probably not persuadable. But I'm worried about the young people. I'm worried about the 19 and 20-year-old college kids who are listening to this and cheering on this anti-Israel sentiment, this anti-Semitic sentiment. And think about when this cancer began growing in the Democrat Party, where they sat quietly aside and did little to nothing to stop it. I don't want to see that happen on the right. And look, I got to say, in elected office, there are very few elected Republicans who are willing to speak out on this. You know, as many of y'all know, I do a podcast every week called Verdict with Ted Cruz. I do it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The Monday podcast, half of it was taking on Tucker very directly, who chose this week to say that he was open to apologizing to Osama bin Laden's family, and also to saying he doesn't know that Hamas is a terrorist organization. It just seems like a political organization. And I said, look, Tucker Carlson is turning into Ilhan Omar. Like this is bizarre. It is ridiculous. By the way, no, we should not be apologizing to Osama bin Laden's family. He's a psychopathic, genocidal lunatic who murdered nearly 3,000 people on 9/11, and I have no interest in saying to his kids, I'm sorry your daddy was an evil man. I'm very glad we came and took out Osama bin Laden. If you kill Americans, you should expect the very same result.
It's a little hard for me to see in the back. So in turns, if you want to just select a victim with their hand up.
But by the way, I'm particularly amused that you had Heritage staff holding the mic from Frank Gaffney, because you never know what Frank's going to say.
I figured we'd go there first.
Yeah. What is your perspective on the United States engaging in business and supporting Karakkal, Pakistan, given its richness in critical mineral resources and strategic location at the crossroads of Afghanistan, Iran, China, and Russia? Also, U.S. has success stories in the past when U.S. supported South Korea, Kosovo, Bosnia, and now those countries are strong allies to the U.S. Why? What do you think about it?
You know, I referenced in my remarks a speech I gave at Heritage some time ago in which I divided the world into different groups. Friends, enemies, competitors, and then I had a group that I called problematic allies. And the problematic allies, the main examples I pointed to were Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan. All three are allies. We want all three to remain allies. But all three have had real challenges, and in significant part, real challenges in terms of coddling jihadists and at times openly supporting jihadists. And I think it is in our interest to remain allies with those nations, but at the same time to make the case that their policies supporting jihadists are unacceptable and are endangering Americans. And so that, look, Pakistan, when we took out bin Laden, we did so with the government of Pakistan's knowledge. That was the right thing to do, but they have undoubtedly been, it is a challenging relationship, and I don't think it will suddenly get easier anytime soon.
I will just clarify. It's Karakkal, Pakistan. I will give you a handout. It's not Pakistan. I will just give you just a moment.
You can give it to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentleman in the third row. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam. Senator, good afternoon. My name is Johannes Mezger from Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. I would like to believe that some of these issues that you've discussed, Senator, also requires a global collaboration and attention. So in terms of U.S.'s foreign relation, do you think there is some work needs to be done in terms of galvanizing and mobilizing other countries, including Africa and the Horn of Africa, in addressing these issues? Do you think that there is a vacuum that you're creating from the global governance structure?
Very much so, and it's an excellent question. One of the consequences of Republicans taking the majority is, in addition to my now being the chair of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, I'm also the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Africa. And so that is just this year. I will say, in the previous 2 years, I don't think the Africa Subcommittee had even a single hearing when the Democrats had it. I can tell you we've had multiple hearings, and my approach to every endeavor is, if you're going to do it, you bring vigor and energy and action. And I think Africa is, number one, it has an incredibly young population that is growing dramatically on the continent. But number two, Africa is becoming a major battleground between global powers. And in particular in Africa, number one, you have the challenge of jihadism, which is an enormous challenge there. And actually, just this week, I introduced legislation focused on Nigeria, and in particular their persecution of Christians, where over 50,000 Christians have been murdered in Nigeria, and laying out specific sanctions to go target, and not just target Boko Haram and the terrorists that are carrying it out, but also to sanction the government officials, the judges, the ministers who are facilitating that persecution of Christians. I think Africa is also a major battleground in the global power struggle with China. And I will say, when I got here 13 years ago, and Victoria is a witness to this, I said back then that I believed China poses the single greatest geopolitical threat to the United States for the next 100 years. That at the time was a very lonely position. Every Democrat disagreed with it, and most of the Republicans disagreed with it. They looked at China and they saw nothing but dollar signs as far as the eye could see. I will say more and more people, their eyes have opened up to the threat that Communist China poses, particularly COVID, the malevolence of the Chinese Communist government. And look, as you know, I'm Cuban American. My father was imprisoned and tortured in Cuba. My Tia Sonia was imprisoned and tortured in Cuba. I hate communists. Viscerally, communism is the most evil ideology humanity has ever produced. It has murdered more people. It has put more people in captivity and suffering and poverty than any ideology man has produced. But the Chinese are engaged in a 1,000-year war against the United States. And their objective is complete and total global dominance. The United States, we are often slow to action. We tend to slumber on threats. But I think more and more people's eyes are opening up, and I think Africa is a major battleground. And China comes in with the Belt and Road Initiative. They come in offering billions of dollars, and it's a little bit like a drug dealer at a junior high who's saying, hey, try a free sample. And I will tell you, the countries that accept it, they end up, they're given some supposedly free infrastructure project. Number one, the Chinese send in Chinese workers, so they don't actually create jobs in the countries that accept it. Number two, they embed it with listening devices. If you take Huawei, guess what? The Chinese spies now can listen to everything you say in your country, which is a really bad idea. And then countries get trapped in debt traps, and it has not worked out well. And by the way, they build crappy infrastructure. Other than that, it's great. I'd much rather, look, being friends with the United States is a much better proposition. So that's the case I'm making to African leaders. You have a choice between being in an exploitative relationship with China, or you can be friends with America. And I'd much rather be friends based on shared commercial interests, things like critical minerals, that we have enormous opportunities in Africa. And most of the African nations are quite eager to pursue those relationships. I will say that same battle in Africa we're also seeing in Latin America. And Latin America likewise is a battle with China. Just 2 weeks ago, I went down to Latin America, and I was in El Salvador, Panama, and Mexico. And a huge purpose of the visit, I met with President Bukele in El Salvador, met with foreign ministers, and a huge part of the trip was focusing on China and the Panama Canal. I mean, I went right up to where that Chinese port is. They have ports on both ends of the canal in order to be able to shut the canal down. I was on the Pacific side of the canal where I was. You have the Chinese port right there at the mouth. The Chinese are building a bridge across the canal right now, and they're digging a tunnel underneath the canal for a metro line. All of that are Chinese companies they're putting in, and look, the scenario that I talked with the Panamanians about, they're not doing so out of the goodness of their heart. And if, God forbid, China makes a move on Taiwan and invades Taiwan, I think the odds are unacceptably high that China would act to shut down the Panama Canal. And the consequences would be devastating to Panama. I was making the case to the Panamanians, this is not good for you, but it would also be devastating to the United States. Much of our military fleet is in the Atlantic, and with the Panama Canal shut down, it would add weeks to being able to move Navy vessels to the Pacific to deal with anything in Taiwan. And so, whether it's Africa or Latin America, we are in, I believe in American leadership, and we need to have open eyes to who our enemies are, and we need to be smart and vigorous and effective, because who wins that battle, America or China, is massively consequential for the future of the United States and the future of the world.
Unfortunately, we have gotten the hook. I know you can actually talk for quite some time, having experienced it.
It is an occupational hazard.
Yes. So unfortunately, that has to be our last question. We're going to have to get Senator Cruz back over to the Senate to do his good work for not only the people of Texas, but for all of us as well. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Senator Cruz. It is always a pleasure to have you at Heritage.